The galaxy was old. It had been spinning its stars and growing its civilizations for billions of years before a small blue planet on the edge of the Orion Spur ever produced anything more interesting than moss. By the time humanity finally figured out how to leave their own solar system, there were already more than 800 known species talking, trading, fighting, and building empires across the Milky Way. They called their great alliance the Galactic Concord. It was not a government exactly. It was more like a massive meeting room where every species had a seat and every species had a voice, even if some voices were louder than others. The elder races, those who had been traveling between stars for tens of thousands of years, sat at the top. They made the real decisions. Everyone else listened and tried to keep up. When humanity arrived, nobody paid much attention. They were soft. They were small. They lived for less than a century, which most species found almost tragically short. Their bodies broke easily. They could not breathe underwater. They could not survive in vacuum. They had no natural armor, no claws worth mentioning, no venom, no ability to see in the dark without machines. On paper, they were one of the most fragile, intelligent species the galaxy had ever recorded. The elder races welcomed them politely the way a group of adults might welcome a child to a dinner party. They gave humanity a seat in the Concorde. They opened a few trade routes. They sent scientists to study Earth and its strange, water-covered surface. And then they mostly forgot about the humans and went back to their own business. That was 214 years ago. In those 2 centuries, humanity had done what humanity always does. They spread, they built, they adapted. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy, and they were not the smartest, and they were certainly not the oldest. But they had something that most species found difficult to understand. They had a stubbornness that went all the way down to their bones. They refused to stop. They refused to quit. They took every problem the galaxy threw at them, and they simply kept going until the problem gave up before they did. They built colonies on harsh worlds that other species had abandoned. They turned dead moons into farming stations. They traded with anyone who would trade with them and learned the languages and customs of dozens of alien cultures. They were friendly. They were curious. They asked too many questions and they laughed too loudly, and they formed emotional bonds with anything that moved, including several species of alien wildlife that absolutely did not want to be pet. Most of the galaxy found them amusing. A few found them annoying. Almost nobody found them threatening. That was their first mistake. The Velthari Dominion had been watching humanity with different eyes. The Velthari were insectoid. They stood nearly 3 meters tall on 6 powerful legs, with armored exoskeletons that could stop a low-caliber bullet and mandibles that could cut through steel cable. They had compound eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not even imagine, and they communicated through a combination of clicking sounds and chemical signals that made their coordination in battle almost perfect. When they were also, by the standards of the galaxy, bullies. The Velthari had built their dominion through conquest. For over 3,000 years, they had expanded their territory by taking what they wanted from species too weak to stop them. They were not the largest empire in the galaxy, but they were one of the most aggressive. They respected only one thing: strength. If you were strong, they left you alone. If you were weak, you were either a servant or a target. Humanity, in their eyes, was weak. It started small. A Velthari raiding party would intercept a human cargo ship on the edge of contested space. They would take the cargo, rough up the crew, and send them limping home with a warning. The first few times it happened, humanity filed formal complaints with the Galactic Concord. The Concord issued statements of concern, so the Velthari ignored them. Then it got worse. Velthari warships began appearing near human frontier colonies. They would orbit for days, scanning, watching, making their presence known. It was intimidation, pure and simple. When human authorities demanded they leave, the Velthari would click their mandibles in what passed for laughter among their kind and take their time departing. The raids increased. Cargo ships became a regular target, then mining stations, then small outposts. The Velthari began taking prisoners, human workers kidnapped from remote stations and forced into labor camps deep inside Dominion space. The stories that trickled back were horrible. Humans forced to work in toxic mines without protection. Humans kept in cages designed for creatures half their size. Humans who died from exhaustion and were simply replaced by the next shipment of captives. Humanity screamed for help. They brought evidence to the Concorde. They showed recordings. They presented testimony from escaped prisoners. They begged the elder races to intervene. The Concorde held votes. The Concorde issued sanctions. The Concorde drafted strongly worded resolutions condemning Velthari aggression against human territories. The Velthari used those resolutions as kindling. Nothing changed. Year after year, the harassment continued. The Velthari grew bolder because nobody stopped them. The elder races clucked their tongues and shook their heads and said what a shame it was, but none of them were willing to risk their own ships and their own soldiers to protect a species that had only been part of the Concorde for 2 centuries. Humanity was too new, too small, too unimportant, and so the humans did what they could on their own. They strengthened their border patrols. They armed their cargo ships. They built better defenses around their colonies. They were not a warlike species by nature, but they were not stupid either. They knew that nobody was coming to save them, and so they learned to save themselves. For a while it was enough. The raids continued, but they became more costly for the Velthari. Human ships fought back. Human colonies had weapons now. The Velthari lost soldiers, and while they did not care about individual lives the way humans did, they cared about efficiency. Raiding human space was becoming more trouble than it was worth. Warlord Skethon did not like this. Skethon was the supreme military commander of the Velthari Dominion. He had risen to power through a combination of brilliant tactical thinking and absolute ruthlessness. He had crushed rebellions within his own species. He had conquered 3 minor civilizations and absorbed them into the Dominion. He was feared by his own people almost as much as he was feared by his enemies, and he was insulted by humanity's resistance. In Velthari culture, a weaker species was supposed to submit. That was the natural order. The strong ruled, the weak obeyed. Humanity's refusal to accept their place, their stubborn, infuriating insistence on fighting back, was not just a military problem for Skethon. It was a personal insult. It was a challenge to everything the Dominion stood for. He decided that humanity needed a lesson, not a raid, not a skirmish, a lesson that the entire galaxy would see and remember, a lesson that would break the humans so completely that they would never resist again. He chose Elysium 7. Elysium 7 was a human colony world in the Vega system. It was not a military target. It had no strategic value. It had no weapons factories, no shipyards, no military bases of any significance. What it had was people, 11 million of them, families, children, workers and teachers and doctors and artists. It had schools and hospitals and parks and libraries. It had a university that was famous across human space for its research in xenobiology, the study of alien life. It was by any measure a civilian world, a peaceful world, a world full of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Skethon chose it precisely because of this. The Velthari fleet arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning, local time. 47 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and surrounded Elysium 7 in a formation that left no gaps, no escape routes, no hope. The colony's small defense force, 3 patrol ships and a handful of ground-based weapons, tried to fight. They were destroyed in less than 4 minutes. Then the bombardment began. The Velthari used plasma bombardment. It was not the most advanced weapon in the galaxy, but it was one of the most devastating against planetary surfaces. Superheated plasma rained down from orbit like fire from an angry god. It struck the surface at thousands of degrees and turned everything it touched into glass and ash. The cities went first, then the farmlands, then the forests and the oceans and the mountains. The entire surface of Elysium 7 was methodically, systematically burned. 11 million people. Gone. The whole thing took less than 6 hours. But Skethon was not satisfied with simply destroying the colony. He wanted the galaxy to watch. He ordered his communications officers to broadcast the bombardment live on every subspace channel they could reach. He wanted every species in the Concorde to see what happened to those who defied the Velthari Dominion. And the galaxy watched. They watched as cities melted. They watched as oceans boiled away into steam. They watched as the green and blue surface of a living world turned black and orange, and then finally a dull, dead gray. They watched as 11 million voices were silenced forever. The recordings spread across the galaxy like a disease. Every species saw them. Every government received them. Every news network played them on repeat, over and over, until the images burned themselves into the collective memory of 1,000 civilizations. The Concord Council held an emergency session. There were speeches. There were condemnations. There were tears from species that had tear ducts and equivalent displays of grief from those that did not. A resolution was passed declaring the burning of Elysium-7 a crime against galactic civilization. Sanctions were proposed. Tribunals were discussed. None of it meant anything, and everyone knew it. The galaxy waited for humanity's response. They expected rage. They expected screaming and crying and desperate demands for justice. They expected threats, or pleas, or some combination of both. They expected humanity to come before the Concord Council and beg for help, for intervention, for someone, anyone, to punish the monsters who had burned their children alive. Some species expected humanity to declare war, a foolish, suicidal war that the humans could not possibly win, driven by emotion rather than reason. It would be tragic, of course, but it would be understandable. What nobody expected was what actually happened. Nothing. There was no response, no rage, no tears, no threats, no speeches, no demands, no declarations of war. There was only silence. Within 48 hours of the burning of Elysium-7, every human ambassador in the galaxy recalled themselves from their posts. They left quietly. They packed their things, said polite goodbyes to their staff, and boarded ships bound for human space. No explanations were given. Human trade ships that were mid-journey turned around and headed home. Contracts were abandoned. Deliveries were left incomplete. Billions of credits in ongoing business deals were simply walked away from without a word. Human comm channels went dark. The subspace frequencies that humanity used for communication, channels that had been buzzing with activity for 2 centuries, fell silent one by one, like lights being turned off in a building at the end of the day. The borders of human space, normally open, welcoming, busy with traffic, sealed shut. Automated defense platforms activated along every entry point. Warning buoys broadcast a single repeating message in every known galactic language. Human space is closed. Do not enter. Any vessel crossing this boundary will be destroyed without warning. And then there was nothing. No signals, no ships, no communication of any kind. Humanity had simply stopped. The galaxy did not know what to make of it. Some species thought the humans had given up, that the destruction of Elysium-7 had broken them so completely that they had retreated into their own space to grieve and die. Others thought it was a temporary reaction, that humanity would emerge in a few weeks with red eyes and heavy hearts and beg the Concord for help. But a few species, the old ones, the ones who had been watching civilizations rise and fall for longer than most could imagine, saw something different in the silence. They saw something that made their blood run cold. Counselor Mora of the raccoon was one of them. The raccoon were an amphibian species, ancient and wise, who had survived 3 galactic wars by being smart enough to see them coming before anyone else did. Mora was their eldest diplomat, over 400 years old, with skin like wet stone and eyes that had seen more history than most species had lived. Mora sat in the Concord Council chamber and listened to the other species chatter about humanity's silence. Some were confused, some were amused. Some were already dividing up the trade routes and territories that humanity had abandoned. Mora said nothing for a long time, and then, when the chamber had quieted enough for a single voice to be heard, the old counselor spoke. "You are all fools," Mora said, and the chamber went very still. "Every one of you. You hear silence, and you think it means surrender. You think the humans have given up. You think they are hiding?" Mora's ancient eyes swept across the chamber, while lingering on the empty seats where the human ambassadors had once sat. "I have studied humanity for longer than most of you have been alive. I have read their history. I have watched their wars. I have seen what they do when they are pushed to the edge. And I will tell you something that should terrify every single one of you." The chamber was completely silent now. "Humans do not go quiet when they give up," Mora said. Humans go quiet when they are angry, truly angry, the kind of angry that goes beyond screaming and crying and making threats, the kind of angry that is cold and patient and thinks very carefully about what it is going to do next. Mora leaned forward. That silence you hear? That is not grief. That is not surrender. That is the sound of an entire species deciding, together, exactly how they are going to respond. And when they finished deciding, Mora paused, and in that pause, several delegates felt something they had not felt in a very long time. Fear. When they finished deciding, Mora said quietly, I suggest you all be somewhere else. The chamber erupted into arguments. Most of the delegates dismissed Mora's warning as the ramblings of an old creature who had lived too long. The Velthari representative clicked his mandibles in contempt and called humanity a dead species walking. But that night, in the quiet of their own embassies, more than a few delegates found themselves unable to sleep. They lay awake in the dark, thinking about the silence coming from human space and wondering what was growing inside it. Because Mora was right, the silence was not empty. Behind those sealed borders, behind those automated defense platforms, is behind the dark and quiet of a species that had gone still, something was happening. Every government on Earth and every human colony and every system had come together, not in alliance, not in cooperation, in something deeper than that. Something that had never happened before in human history. Total unity. Every factory retooled, every laboratory redirected, every mind, scientist, soldier, engineer, teacher, farmer, turned toward a single purpose. There were no more politics, no more arguments, no more divisions. The burning of Elysium 7 had done something that nothing else in human history had ever managed to do. It had made humanity agree. And in that agreement, in that terrible, focused silence, humanity began to build. They did not build ships. They did not build armies. And they did not build anything the galaxy would have recognized as a weapon. They built something new. And the galaxy, wrapped up in its own noise and its own arguments and its own petty concerns, had no idea what was coming. The silence continued. And inside the silence, humanity worked. The first week after humanity went silent, the galaxy treated it like a curiosity. News networks across 100 worlds ran segments about it. Commentators and analysts sat behind their desks and offered their opinions in calm, measured tones. Some said the humans were mourning. Some said they were reorganizing. Some said they were simply too shocked to respond. A few of the more cynical commentators suggested that humanity had realized how small and powerless they truly were, and had retreated to lick their wounds in private. It was, most agreed, a temporary thing. The humans would come back. They always did. They were emotional creatures, everyone knew that. They needed time to cry and hold each other and process what had happened. In a few weeks, maybe a month, the human ambassadors would return to their seats in the Concord Council. They would be sad and angry, and they would make impassioned speeches, and the Concord would offer sympathy and perhaps some modest aid package, and life would go on. That was the first week. By the second week, the tone had shifted slightly. The human trade ships had not returned. The comm channels were still dark. A few species that depended heavily on human goods. Earth was one of the galaxy's primary exporters of biological medicines, luxury foods, and a dozen types of raw material that only formed in the specific conditions of the Sol system were beginning to feel the pinch. Prices rose. Supply chains strained. Business leaders sent polite inquiries to human space and received nothing in return. By the third week, the curiosity had turned into concern. It was not just the economic disruption, though that was growing more serious by the day. It was the completeness of the silence. In the history of the Galactic Concord, no species had ever simply withdrawn from galactic civilization like this. Species had gone to war. Species had collapsed. Species had even gone extinct. But no species had simply chosen to stop talking. Ambassadors from several species attempted to visit human space in person. Their ships approached the border and were met by the automated defense platforms. The warning buoys repeated their message: "Do not enter. Any vessel crossing this boundary will be destroyed without warning." The ambassadors turned back. Diplomatic messages were sent on every frequency, in every language, using every protocol the galaxy had ever devised. They bounced off the sealed border like stones thrown against a wall. There was no response, not even an acknowledgement that the messages had been received. By the end of the first month, the concern had turned into something deeper, something that crept into conversations late at night and made diplomats and military officers and intelligence analysts stare at their ceilings in the dark. Nobody said the word out loud yet, but they were all thinking it. Fear. The intelligence agencies were the first to act. Every major species in the Concord had some form of intelligence service. Spies, analysts, surveillance networks that watched the galaxy and reported back to their governments. These agencies now turned their attention to human space with an intensity that would have been considered rude under normal circumstances. The Keldoran, a species known for their advanced stealth technology, sent 3 of their best spy ships toward human space. These were the finest surveillance vessels in the galaxy, capable of cloaking themselves so completely that they were invisible to every known form of detection. They had penetrated the defenses of empires and slipped through war zones without being noticed. They were ghosts. None of them came back. The first ship crossed the border and went silent immediately. No distress signal. And no final transmission, just nothing. The second ship was sent a week later, following a different route. Same result. The third ship was equipped with a dead man switch, a device that would automatically broadcast a burst transmission if the ship was destroyed or its crew was incapacitated. The ship crossed the border. The dead man switch never activated. The ship simply vanished, as if it had never existed. The Keldoran intelligence service was shaken. In 300 years of operation, they had never lost a stealth ship. Now they had lost 3 in 3 weeks. They quietly shared their findings with a few trusted allies, and the fear that had been growing in the dark corners of the galaxy took another step forward. Other species tried other methods. The Thraxi, a silicon-based species with a talent for building extremely small machines, sent a swarm of microscopic surveillance drones toward Earth. The drones were each smaller than a grain of sand, designed to drift through space undetected and observe from a distance. 2 billion of them were launched from a concealed station just outside human space. Not a single one made it through. Somewhere along the way, the Thraxi engineers could not determine exactly where. Every single drone simply stopped functioning. No damage. No interference that they could detect. They just turned off, as if someone had reached out and flipped a switch on 2 billion individual machines at the same time. The Thraxi did not try again. Long-range scanning was attempted from outside human borders. Every form of sensor the galaxy possessed was aimed at soul space. Electromagnetic scanners, gravitational wave detectors, subspace resonance monitors, tachyon pulse arrays. The results were identical across every method. Nothing. Human space appeared as a blank spot on every scan, as if someone had thrown a curtain over an entire region of the galaxy. This should not have been possible. The technology required to block every known form of detection simultaneously was, according to the best scientists in the Concord, theoretical at best and fantasy at worst. No species had ever achieved it. The fact that humanity, a species that had been traveling between stars for only 2 centuries, appeared to have done it was deeply, fundamentally troubling. The Concord Council convened a special session to discuss the situation. And the chamber was more crowded than usual. Every species wanted answers. Every species wanted someone else to provide them. Ambassador Rethan of the Silurians, a tall and graceful avian species known for their calm demeanor, opened the session with a carefully measured statement. "We are here because we do not know what is happening inside human space," Rethan said, her feathered crest flat against her skull in a display of unease that her species rarely showed in public. "We have attempted to make contact through diplomatic channels, through intelligence operations, and through remote observation. All attempts have failed. Human space is, for all practical purposes, invisible to us." She paused and looked around the chamber. "We must consider the possibility that this situation is more serious than we initially believed." The chamber erupted immediately. Delegates shouted over each other in half a dozen languages. Some demanded action. Some demanded patience. Some blamed the Velthari for creating this crisis. Some blamed humanity for overreacting. The Velthari delegate, a mid-ranking officer named Kresh, who had replaced the usual ambassador at Warlord Skethon's orders, stood in his section and clicked his mandibles loudly enough to silence the nearest rows. "The humans are hiding," Kresh said, his compound eyes reflecting the chamber lights like wet glass. "This is what weak species do when they are afraid. They run. They hide. They seal their doors and hope the danger passes. There is nothing mysterious about it. Son, and there is nothing to fear." Several delegates murmured in agreement. It was a comforting interpretation. It made sense. It fit the galaxy's understanding of humanity as a small, fragile, emotional species that had simply been pushed too far and broken. Counselor Mora of the Raccoon had been sitting quietly at the back of the chamber, as was their habit. The ancient amphibian listened to the arguments with an expression that might have been patience or might have been disgust. With the Raccoon, it was always difficult to tell. When the chamber had settled enough for a single voice to carry, Mora spoke. Not loudly. The old counselor never spoke loudly. But somehow, when Mora spoke, everyone listened. "May I ask the Velthari delegate a question?" Kresh turned his massive head toward Mora. "I want to ask. How many spy ships have the Velthari sent into human space?" The chamber went quiet. Kresh's mandibles twitched, a sign of discomfort that he could not fully suppress. "That is a classified matter," Kresh said. "7, Mora said calmly. "You sent 7 ships. I know this because my people have been watching yours for a very long time. 7 ships, each carrying your best operatives, using your most advanced stealth technology. And none of them came back. Not a single one." The silence in the chamber was absolute. "The Keldoran lost 3, Mora continued. "The Thraxi lost 2 billion surveillance drones. The Pyrosians lost a deep space listening station that was so secret that even their own government did not know about it until it disappeared. Every attempt to see inside human space has failed. Not partially. Not mostly, completely." Mora stood slowly, joints creaking with age, and walked to the center of the chamber floor. Every eye in the room followed. "Now," Mora said, "let us think about what that means. Not what we want it to mean, not what makes us comfortable, what it actually means." The old counselor raised one webbed hand and began counting. "First, humanity has somehow developed the ability to detect and neutralize every known form of surveillance in the galaxy. Stealth ships that have never been detected before. Microscopic drones. Long-range sensors operating on principles that humanity was not even supposed to understand. All of it countered. All of it at the same time." A second finger rose. "Second, they did this in less than 1 month. 1 month ago, one humanity was a mid-tier spacefaring civilization with respectable but unremarkable technology. Today, they appear to have made advancements that our best scientists say should take centuries." A third finger. "Third, they have not used any of this capability offensively. They have not attacked anyone. They have not made threats. They have not even spoken. They have simply made themselves invisible and waited." Mora let the hand drop. "Ask yourselves why a species would do that. Ask yourselves what kind of species develops impossible technology, deploys it across their entire territory, and then sits in silence waiting." Nobody answered. "I will tell you," Mora said, "a species that is not finished yet. A species that does not want to be disturbed while it works. A species that is building something so significant that it needs every single resource, every single mind, and every single moment to complete it." Mora looked directly at the Velthari delegate. "You burned their colony. You killed 11 million of their people. You broadcast it as entertainment, and now they are quiet. You think that means they are afraid." Mora shook their head slowly. "I think it means they are angry. And I think that when they finally break that silence, whatever they have built in the dark is going to make every weapon the galaxy has ever seen look like a child's toy." The chamber was so quiet that delegates could hear each other breathing. "I strongly recommend," Mora said, turning to walk back to their seat, "that the Concord begin making preparations. Because whatever is coming, it is coming soon. And when it arrives, I do not believe any of us will be ready for it." The session dissolved into arguments that lasted for hours. In the end, no action was taken. The Concord was too divided, too fractured by competing interests and old rivalries to agree on anything meaningful. Resolutions were proposed and debated and amended and debated again until they meant nothing. But Mora's words had planted a seed. In the days that followed, several species began quietly moving their assets away from Velthari space. Trade routes were rerouted. Military patrols shifted their patterns. Civilian populations on worlds near the human border were offered generous relocation subsidies. Nobody said it was because of the humans. Nobody had to. The Velthari response was exactly what everyone expected. Warlord Skethon went on a broadcast that reached most of the galaxy. He stood in his war chamber, surrounded by his generals, his massive form gleaming under harsh lights. His mandibles spread wide in what the Velthari considered a display of dominance and what most other species considered terrifying. The humans cower in their space like vermin in a hole, Skethon said. They have sealed their borders because they know what will happen if they face us again. Elysium 7 was a lesson. If the humans have learned it, they may keep their remaining worlds. If they have not, he paused and clicked his mandibles together with a sound like breaking bone. Then we will teach them again and again until there is nothing left to teach. He announced that the Dominion was assembling a second fleet, larger than the first, more heavily armed. This fleet would push into the territories that humanity had abandoned when they sealed their borders. The trade routes, the mining stations, the outposts that were now empty and undefended. The Velthari would claim it all. And if the humans object, Skethon said, his compound eyes glittering, they are welcome to come out and say so. The broadcast ended. Across the galaxy, billions of beings watched it and had different reactions. Some cheered, some shook their heads, some felt sick, and a very few, felt a cold certainty that Skethon had just made the worst mistake of his life. Months passed. The Velthari fleet assembled. The silence from human space continued. And inside that silence, behind the sealed borders, in the blank sensor screens, in the vanished spy ships, the work continued. Earth had become something it had never been before. Every nation on the planet was working together, not cooperating, not collaborating, working together as a single organism. The old divisions, nations, corporations, political parties, religions, had not been erased. They had simply become irrelevant. When someone burns 11 million of your people alive and broadcasts it for entertainment, the things that used to seem important stop seeming important very quickly. The factories ran day and night, not building weapons, at least not weapons that anyone in the galaxy would have recognized, building something else, something that existed at the edge of physics, in the strange spaces between quantum mechanics and reality, where the rules of the universe became suggestions rather than laws. The scientists worked in shifts, sleeping in their laboratories, eating at their desks, dreaming about equations and waking up to write them down. They were making breakthroughs that should have taken decades, then centuries, and they were making them in weeks. Not because they were smarter than everyone else in the galaxy, but because they were more motivated than anyone in the galaxy had ever been. Grief is a powerful fuel. Rage is even more powerful, but the combination of grief and rage, refined by a cold and patient intelligence, focused by the memory of 11 million people who would never come home, that was something beyond powerful. That was something new. The colonies contributed too. Every human world, every station, every outpost that remained inside the sealed borders redirected its resources toward the central effort. With food production was streamlined to maximum efficiency. Luxury goods ceased to exist. Entertainment industries shut down voluntarily. Sports leagues suspended their seasons. Universities converted their research programs. Everything that was not essential to the project was set aside without complaint. There were no protests. There were no objections. There were no holdouts or rebels or contrarians who insisted on their right to disagree. For the first time in the long and argumentative history of the human species, every single person agreed on what needed to be done. It was, in its own terrible way, beautiful, and it was almost finished. Deep in the Sol system, in a facility hidden inside an asteroid that had been hollowed out over the course of 4 months, the final components were being assembled. And the scientists who built them handled them with gloves and whispered to each other as if they were in a church, because in a way they were. What they were building was sacred, not because it was holy, but because it represented everything humanity had decided to become. They did not call it a weapon. The word felt wrong. It was more than a weapon. It was a statement. It was a message. It was the answer to a question that the galaxy had asked by burning 11 million people alive. What will you do about it? The answer was almost ready. Outside human space, the galaxy continued to spin. The Velthari fleet grew larger. The Concorde argued. The silence stretched on, and with every passing day it grew heavier, like a weight pressing down on the chest of every species in the galaxy. They could all feel it. Something was coming. See, something they could not see and could not measure and could not understand. It was like the feeling before a storm, when the air goes still and the animals go quiet and the sky turns a color that is not quite right. The galaxy held its breath, and the silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Somewhere in the deepest levels of the Raccoon homeworld, Counselor Mora sat alone in a darkened room, staring at a star map. The old amphibian traced one webbed finger along the border of human space, that blank, impenetrable boundary that had become the most frightening thing in the galaxy. Mora had lived for 4 centuries. They had seen wars and plagues and the rise and fall of empires. They had watched civilizations burn themselves to ash and watched new ones grow from the ruins. They had learned over a very long life, so to read the patterns of history the way a sailor reads the patterns of the sea, and right now every pattern Mora could see pointed toward the same conclusion. The storm was coming, it was close, and when it arrived, the galaxy would never be the same. Mora closed their eyes and thought about the children of Elysium 7, the ones who liked stars, the ones who liked drawing, the ones who had names and faces and dreams and futures that were turned to glass and ash in 6 hours. "I hope it is enough," Mora whispered to the darkness. "Whatever they are building, I hope it is enough to make sure this never happens again." The darkness did not answer, but somewhere across the vast and silent distance of space, humanity was listening, and they were almost ready. It had been exactly 1 year. 365 Earth days since the sky above Elysium 7 turned to fire. 365 days since 11 million voices went silent forever. 365 days since humanity sealed its borders and disappeared behind a wall of silence that the galaxy could not break, could not see through, and could not understand. The galaxy had grown used to it. Not comfortable. Nobody was comfortable with the silence, but used to it, the way a person gets used to a strange noise in their house. At first it keeps them awake at night. Then they stop noticing it. Then they forget it was ever unusual. Life went on. Trade routes adjusted to the absence of human goods. Species that had depended on human medicines found alternatives, most of them inferior but functional. The empty seats in the Concord Council gathered dust. The news networks stopped running stories about the human withdrawal because there was nothing new to report, and audiences had grown tired of analysts saying the same things over and over. The Velthari had claimed most of the abandoned human frontier territories, mining stations, outposts, trade hubs. They stripped them of anything valuable and planted their flags and declared it a great victory. Warlord Skethon held a ceremony to mark the expansion of the Dominion and gave a speech about the inevitable triumph of the strong over the weak. His generals clicked their mandibles in approval, and the soldiers stamped their legs against the ground in the traditional Velthari salute. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. The humans were gone, and the galaxy was moving on. And then on the anniversary of the burning of Elysium 7, at exactly the same hour and minute that the first plasma round had struck the colony's surface, every communication device in the galaxy activated at the same time. Every screen, every speaker, every subspace relay, every personal communicator, every military channel, every civilian frequency, every encrypted government network, every private corporate line, every ship-to-ship radio, every planetary broadcast system, every orbital communications satellite, every single device in the galaxy that was capable of receiving a signal received the same signal at the same moment. It should not have been possible. The technology required to do this was beyond anything the galaxy had ever conceived. Each species had its own communication systems, its own frequencies, us its own encryption protocols. Some of these systems were deliberately incompatible with each other. Some used technology that was fundamentally different from anything other species used. Some were so secret that their own governments did not know all of the technical details. None of that mattered. The signal cut through everything, every firewall, every encryption, every jamming system, every countermeasure. It passed through military-grade security like water through cloth. It appeared on devices that were powered off. It appeared on devices that were not connected to any network. It appeared on screens that were broken and speakers that were damaged. For a single terrifying moment, the entire galaxy was connected to one channel, hearing one voice, watching one message. And then a woman appeared. She was human, middle-aged, etched by human standards. Dark hair with streaks of gray, lines around her eyes that spoke of a year of tears and sleepless nights. She wore simple clothes, a plain shirt, nothing formal, nothing military. She sat at a desk that could have been in any ordinary room on any ordinary world. She did not look like a soldier. She did not look like a politician. She looked like exactly what she was, a teacher. Her name was Dr. Lena Vasquez. 1 year ago, she had taught biology to 8-year-old children at the Bright Horizons Academy on Elysium 7. She had been off-world when the bombardment happened, visiting her sick mother on a neighboring colony. She had watched the destruction from a ship's viewport, screaming, and as the world where her students lived and laughed and asked her endless questions about why butterflies had wings and whether fish could dream, turned into a ball of fire and glass. She had lost everything: her students, her colleagues, her home, her husband, her 2 daughters aged 6 and 9. She was not chosen to deliver this message because she was powerful. She was chosen because she was ordinary, because Earth wanted the galaxy to hear its message from the mouth of someone who had been hurt, not someone who wanted to hurt back. They wanted the galaxy to understand that this was not about power. This was about pain. This was about 11 million people who deserved to be alive and were not. She looked into the camera. Her eyes were dry. Her voice when she spoke was steady. It's not cold. That was the thing that most species would remember afterward. Not cold, just very, very certain. "My name is Lena Vasquez," she said. Across the galaxy, billions of beings froze. On every world, in every ship, in every station and outpost and colony and capital city, people stopped what they were doing and listened. Not because they chose to, because they had no choice. The signal was everywhere. The voice was inescapable. I was a teacher on Elysium 7. I taught biology to children. My students were 8 years old. They liked to ask me questions about animals and stars and why the sky was blue. They were curious. They were kind. They had favorite colors and best friends and pet animals and drawings stuck to the walls of my classroom. She paused, not for dramatic effect, just to breathe, just to hold herself together for a little bit longer. Their names were real. Their lives were real. They were not soldiers. They were not threats. They were children, and you burned them alive. Every Velthari who heard those words felt something shift inside them. Most of them pushed it down. Weakness, they told themselves. Sentiment. The strong do not feel guilt for doing what is necessary. But a few of them, the young ones, the ones who had not yet learned to bury their doubts deep enough, felt something crack. "You did not just kill them," Lena continued. "You broadcasted. You turned their deaths into a show. You wanted the galaxy to watch. You wanted everyone to see how powerful you are. You wanted us to be afraid." She leaned forward slightly, just slightly. But somehow across the vast distances of space, through screens and speakers and subspace relays, every being in the galaxy felt the weight of that small movement. "You wanted us to be afraid," she repeated. "I need you to understand something. I am not a soldier. I am not a general. I am not a president or a commander or a warrior. I am a teacher who lost her children. All of them. My students. My daughters. Everyone I loved." Her voice did not waver. That was the part that frightened people most. The absolute steadiness of it. The control. "I was chosen to deliver this message because Earth wanted you to hear it from someone like me. Not from our warships, not from our generals, not from our weapons, from a woman who taught children how plants grow." She straightened in her chair. This is Earth's final warning. The words hit the galaxy like a physical force. When on 1,000 worlds, beings felt their hearts, or whatever equivalent organ pumped whatever equivalent fluid through their bodies, skip a beat. We will not negotiate. We will not petition your councils. We will not file complaints or ask for resolutions or beg for justice from an organization that watched our people burn and did nothing but talk. Several Concord delegates, listening from their offices and chambers, felt those words like a slap. We are giving the Velthari Dominion one galactic standard cycle. One cycle. That is how long you have to publicly surrender and submit to reparations that we will determine. She held up one finger. 1. If this deadline passes without surrender, there will be no second warning. She lowered her hand. There will be no invasion. There will be no occupation. There will be no fleet. And there will be no war. What will happen is not war. I am told that there is no word in any galactic language for what will happen. We had to make a new one. For the first time, something moved behind her eyes. Not rage, something deeper. Something that had been sitting in her chest for a year, growing heavier every day, and was now finally being let out. I do not want this, she said, and her voice finally showed its first crack. I became a teacher because I believe in life. I believe in growth. I believe in children asking questions and the future being better than the past. The woman I was before Elysium 7 would have begged for peace. She would have asked for mercy and understanding and dialogue. She paused again, a long pause this time. That woman died with her daughters. The crack sealed itself. Her voice became steel again. Stated to the rest of the galaxy, we have no fight with you. We have no anger toward you, though we will remember that you watched our people die and did nothing. That is a conversation for another day. She looked directly into the camera, and somehow across the galaxy, it felt like she was looking directly at every being who was watching. Stay clear of Velthari space. Do not send ships. Do not send aid. Do not interfere. What is going to happen cannot be interfered with. It cannot be stopped. It cannot be reversed. And it cannot be undone. One final pause. One final breath. You were warned. The transmission ended. The galaxy stared at blank screens and silent speakers and tried to remember how to breathe. For a long time, nobody said anything. The silence that followed the message was different from the silence of the past year. And that had been the silence of absence, of a species that had gone away. This was the silence of a billion species trying to process what they had just heard. It was the silence of a galaxy that had just been told, in the calmest and most certain voice imaginable, that something unprecedented was about to happen. The reactions came in waves. The first wave was disbelief. Many species simply refused to accept what they had heard. It was a bluff, they said. Humanity was a minor species with limited military capability. They did not have the power to threaten an empire like the Velthari Dominion. The message was emotional theater, designed to save face. It was the final bark of a beaten dog, loud and desperate and meaningless. The second wave was analysis. Military experts and scientists across the galaxy replayed the transmission and examined every detail. Not the content of the message, the delivery mechanism. How had the humans done it? How had they penetrated every communication system in the galaxy simultaneously? The technology required to do this was, according to every model and theory available, simply impossible. And yet it had happened, which meant that either the models were wrong or humanity had achieved something that no species in galactic history had ever achieved. This led to the third wave, fear. Because if humanity could do the impossible with communication technology, what else could they do? The Velthari response came fast. Warlord Skethon was on a broadcast within the hour. He stood in his war chamber, surrounded by his senior generals, and he was furious. His mandibles clacked together with a violence that made his own officers flinch. His compound eyes blazed with a cold, alien rage. A teacher, Skethon said, spitting the word like a curse. They send a teacher, not a warrior, not a general, a soft, weeping female who teaches children about flowers. This is the great human threat? He slammed one massive armored fist against the wall behind him, leaving a dent in the metal. The humans threaten us with words. words spoken by a creature so weak that she could not protect her own offspring. This is not a warning. This is an insult, and the Velthari do not accept insults. He turned to face the camera directly. Hear me, humans. You had your chance to hide behind your sealed borders and be forgotten. You chose instead to threaten the Dominion. You chose to set a deadline. You chose to tell us what we must do. His mandibles spread in a display that every Velthari recognized as a prelude to violence. We choose differently. We choose to come for you. We will not wait for your deadline. We will not wait for your permission. We will bring our fleet to your doorstep, and we will burn Earth the way we burned your precious colony. And when it is over, we will find the teacher and show her what the Velthari do to those who make threats they cannot keep. He gave the order. The Second Fleet, 112 warships, the largest Velthari military formation assembled in over 500 years, was to launch immediately. Not for the frontier, for Seoul, for Earth itself. Across the galaxy, governments scrambled. The Conquered Council held an emergency session that descended into chaos within minutes. So some species demanded intervention, not to help humanity, but to prevent a conflict that could destabilize the entire region. Others argued that the Concord should stay out of it entirely, that this was a matter between the Velthari and the humans, and that getting involved would only make things worse. A few species, the ones who had been paying attention, the ones who had listened to Mora, the ones who had noticed that every spy ship and surveillance drone sent into human space had vanished without a trace, did something different. They ran, not openly, not in a panic, but quietly, efficiently, with the kind of calm urgency that comes from genuine belief that something very bad is about to happen. Ships were recalled from Velthari-adjacent systems. Civilians were evacuated from border worlds. Military assets were pulled back to defensive positions far from the expected zone of conflict. The Raccoon were among the first to move. Counselor Mora had given quiet orders to their government before the transmission had even finished. By the time Skethon's response hit the subspace channels, every Raccoon ship and citizen within 3 sectors of Velthari space was already heading home. When asked by another delegate why they were retreating so quickly, Mora had looked at them with those ancient whetstone eyes and said simply, "Because I listened, and I believe her." The Silurian ambassador, Rathan, caught Mora in the corridor after the session. The avian diplomat was visibly agitated, her feathered crest raised in alarm. "Counselor, what do you think is going to happen?" Mora walked slowly, as they always did, or choosing each word with the care of someone who understood that words had weight. "I think," Mora said, "that the Velthari are about to discover something that many species throughout history have discovered too late." "What is that?" Mora stopped walking and looked at Rathan. For a moment, the old amphibian looked not wise but sad, terribly, deeply sad. "That there is a very large difference between a species that does not fight because it is weak and a species that does not fight because it chooses not to. And that when the second kind of species finally decides to stop choosing not to fight, the results are unlike anything the first kind has ever imagined." Rathan stared at the old counselor. "How bad do you think it will be?" Mora was quiet for a long time. Then the old counselor began walking again, slowly, toward the exit. "Do you remember the human story about the city of Hiroshima?" Mora asked. Rathan had studied human history. She nodded. "The humans dropped a weapon on that city that the world had never seen before," Mora said. "A weapon so powerful that it changed the nature of conflict forever. One weapon, one city, and it ended a war." The old counselor reached the door and paused with one webbed hand on the frame. "That was humanity fighting a war against itself, with the technology they had 300 years ago, on a single planet." Mora turned back to look at Rathan one final time. "Imagine what they have built in a year of silence, with the resources of an entire interstellar civilization united by a grief that has no bottom. And then ask yourself again how bad it will be." The door closed behind Mora. Rathan stood alone in the corridor, listening to the distant sound of the Concord delegates arguing about things that no longer mattered. The deadline was ticking. The Velthari fleet was mobilizing. And somewhere, in the silent heart of Seoul space, humanity was waiting, not hiding, not afraid, not uncertain, just waiting. Because they had given a warning, one warning, and they had meant every single word. The galaxy held its breath, the clock ticked down, and the universe moved toward a moment that would divide all of galactic history into two eras, before and after. The teacher had delivered the message. Now the rest was up to the Velthari, and deep down, in the places they did not talk about, the places where even the bravest soldiers kept their secret fears, the galaxy already knew what was going to happen. The Velthari were not going to surrender, and humanity was not going to bluff. The deadline passed at exactly midnight, Galactic Standard Time, and the silence ended. The deadline expired at midnight, Galactic Standard Time. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Across the galaxy, billions of beings were watching, waiting, holding their breath. Military command centers on 100 worlds had their sensors pointed at Velthari space. Intelligence analysts sat at their screens. Diplomats clutched their communicators. Civilians who had heard Lena Vasquez's message and felt the weight of it in their chests stayed up past their normal sleep cycles, watching the news feeds, waiting for something to happen. 30 seconds. That was how long the galaxy had to wonder if maybe it had all been a bluff after all. Then it began. And there was no countdown, no dramatic announcement, no fleet emerging from human space in a blaze of engines and weapons fire. There was no fleet at all. What happened was nothing like war. No species in the galaxy had ever seen anything like it, because nothing like it had ever existed before. At 12 hours, 0 minutes, and 31 seconds, Galactic Standard Time, sensors across the galaxy registered something impossible. In every system controlled by the Velthari Dominion, all 40 of them, spread across a region of space that spanned hundreds of light years, something activated simultaneously, not nearly simultaneously, not within seconds of each other, simultaneously, at the exact same moment, as if time itself had been told to deliver a message to 40 different places at once. When the military analysts who were watching did not understand what they were seeing at first, their instruments registered energy readings that were off every known scale. Not just high, nonsensical. The numbers did not fit into any existing framework of physics. They were readings from a branch of science that the galaxy had not yet discovered, from a place between quantum mechanics and raw spacetime, where the rules of the universe were not laws but loose suggestions. On the Velthari homeworld of Shekvar, General Cthulhu was in the Central Military Command Bunker, monitoring the Second Fleet's progress toward Sol space. The fleet was 3 days out from human borders. 112 warships, the pride of the Dominion, carrying enough firepower to reduce a dozen worlds to rubble. Cthulhu was studying tactical projections when his communications officer made a sound that Velthari did not normally make. It was a high-pitched click followed by a silence, the equivalent of a human gasp of pure terror. "General," the officer said, "the orbital defense ring." Cthulhu turned to the main display. The orbital defense ring around Shekvar was one of the most formidable military installations in the galaxy. 200 weapons platforms, each the size of a small city, arranged in a sphere around the planet. They could lay down enough firepower to stop any invasion fleet ever assembled. They had been built over the course of 1,000 years, upgraded and reinforced with every advancement in Velthari technology. They were indestructible. They were gone, not destroyed in any way that Cthulhu understood. The sensors showed no explosions, no debris, no energy weapons fire, no impact signatures. The platforms were simply not there anymore. Where 200 massive weapons stations had been orbiting moments ago, there was nothing. Empty space, as if they had never existed. Cthulhu stared at the display. His mandibles worked, but no sound came out. "Show me the shipyards," he said finally. The display shifted. The Velthari had 17 major shipyards in orbit around Shekvar, where the warships of the Dominion were built and maintained. Each one was a complex of dry docks, assembly facilities, fuel depots, and weapon stores that stretched for kilometers. Gone. All of them. The same way. No destruction, no debris. Just empty space where massive structures had been seconds ago. "The Second Fleet," Cthulhu said, and his voice was barely a whisper. The communications officer's hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 attempts to pull up the fleet tracking data. The second fleet, 112 warships, the largest military formation the Velthari had assembled in 5 centuries, had been traveling through a transit corridor in the Velcon system 3 days from human space. The fleet no longer existed, not destroyed, not damaged. The ships had not been blown up or burned or broken. They had been taken apart. Every single warship had been reduced to its base components in less than 1 second. Hulls separated from frames, engines detached from power cores, weapon systems disconnected from targeting arrays, armor plating peeled away from bulkheads. Every single piece of every single ship had been gently, precisely, and impossibly disassembled and left floating in a cloud of perfectly organized components. And every single crew member was alive. Kethul stared at the readings in disbelief. Life pods had activated automatically when the ships came apart. The crew, thousands of Velthari soldiers, were floating in space in emergency pods, alive, unharmed, surrounded by the neatly separated pieces of warships that had been whole moments ago. They had not been killed. They had not been hurt. Their ships had simply been taken apart around them like someone disassembling a puzzle, and they had been set down in life pods as carefully as a parent placing a child in a cradle. "All systems," Kethul said. "Show me all systems." The main display expanded to show the entire Velthari Dominion. 40 star systems, hundreds of military installations, shipyards, defense platforms, weapons depots, fleet staging areas, ground-based missile batteries, orbital weapons arrays, listening posts, supply stations, every single piece of military hardware that the Velthari Dominion possessed. All of it was gone. Every installation, every weapon, every warship, every military satellite, every targeting system, every missile, every gun, across 40 star systems spanning hundreds of light years, the entire military apparatus of the Velthari Dominion, 3,000 years of engineering, 3,000 years of expansion, 3,000 years of building the most feared war machine in the quadrant, had ceased to exist. The timestamp on the sensor logs showed that the entire operation had taken 11 minutes. 11 minutes. In 11 minutes, humanity had reached across hundreds of light years and touched every military target in the Velthari Dominion simultaneously. They had not fired a weapon. They had not launched a missile. They had used something that the galaxy had no name for, something that operated outside the known laws of physics, that could reach across vast distances and reshape matter at the quantum level, that could tell the atoms in a weapons platform to simply let go of each other and drift apart like leaves in a wind. They called them Cascade Lances. The galaxy would learn the name later. In that moment, nobody knew what to call what had just happened. There were no words for it. The physics did not exist to explain it. The technology did not exist to replicate it. It was as if a species of children had suddenly reached up and rearranged the stars. And the most terrifying part, the part that made hardened military commanders across the galaxy feel genuinely sick, was the precision. Every military target had been eliminated. Every single one. Across 40 systems, hundreds of installations, thousands of individual structures, not a single military asset had been missed. The targeting was perfect. The execution was flawless. The humans had demonstrated a level of technological capability that made the combined military might of the entire galactic concord look primitive. But they had not touched anything else. Civilian structures were untouched. Cities stood intact. Power grids hummed along without interruption. Hospitals continued to function. Water treatment plants continued to run. Food production facilities continued to operate. To school, and this detail would be discussed for centuries, were completely unharmed. The humans had removed every weapon, every warship, every military installation from a 40-system empire without breaking a single window in a single school. They had even been careful with the soldiers. Every crew member on every warship, every officer on every defense platform, every worker on every shipyard had been placed in life pods or emergency shelters before their installations were disassembled around them. Not a single Velthari had been killed. Not a single one had even been injured. This was not destruction. This was surgery. This was a surgeon reaching into a body and removing a tumor without damaging a single healthy cell. This was power so absolute and so precise that it could choose exactly what to destroy and what to preserve, and down to the level of individual beings. And the galaxy, watching from its sensor arrays and command centers and living room screens, understood something that would reshape every political and military calculation for the next 1,000 years. Humanity had not shown them a weapon. Humanity had shown them restraint. Because if they could do this, if they could reach across hundreds of light years and disassemble an entire military empire in 11 minutes without harming a single civilian, then they could have done something else entirely. They could have disassembled the cities too. They could have disassembled the hospitals and the schools and the factories and the homes. They could have disassembled the Velthari themselves. Every man, woman, and child on every world, broken apart at the atomic level, was scattered like dust in the void. They could have committed the most complete genocide in the history of the galaxy, and there would have been nothing anyone could have done to stop them. They chose not to. On Shekvar, General Kethul stood in a command bunker that was now, technically, the most powerful military installation the Velthari still possessed, because it had a locked door and some communication equipment. Everything else was gone. 3,000 years of military power, gone in 11 minutes. The Velthari Dominion, the most feared military force in the quadrant, had been reduced to a civilization that could not defend itself against a moderately armed merchant vessel. Kethul stared at the empty displays for a very long time. Then a new signal came in. A single ship had entered the Shekvar system. It was small, absurdly small by military standards, about the size of a Velthari shuttle. It carried no visible weapons. It broadcast no threats. It simply appeared at the edge of the system and moved slowly, calmly, toward the Velthari homeworld. Every remaining sensor on Shekvar locked onto the ship. There were no weapons to aim at it, but old habits die hard. The ship came to a stop in high orbit above the planet. It was close enough that, on a clear night, citizens on the surface might have seen it as a tiny point of light among the stars, a small, unremarkable light. Easy to miss. And then it broadcast on an open channel that every being on Shekvar could hear. The voice belonged to Admiral Kofi Asante of the United Earth Fleet. He was 63 years old. He had been born in a small town in Ghana, ish on the west coast of Africa, on Earth. Before the burning of Elysium-7, he had been a logistics officer. Not a combat commander, not a strategist, but an organizer. A man who made sure supplies got where they needed to go and people had what they needed to do their jobs. He had been chosen for this task for the same reason Lena Vasquez had been chosen for hers. Not because he was powerful, because he was ordinary, because humanity wanted the galaxy to understand that this was not about generals and admirals and warlords. This was about regular people who had been pushed too far. His voice was calm, not cold, not threatening, just calm, the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty. This message is for the people of the Velthari Dominion and for every species in the galactic Concord. He paused, and in that pause, the galaxy listened harder than it had ever listened to anything. My name is Kofi Asante. I am an admiral in the United Earth Fleet. 1 year ago, your forces destroyed our colony on Elysium-7 and killed 11 million of our people. You broadcast their deaths as entertainment. Another pause. Not for effect. Just a man choosing his words carefully because he knew they would be remembered for a very long time. Your military no longer exists. Your weapons are gone. Your warships are gone. Your defense platforms are gone. Your ability to wage war against anyone, human or otherwise, no longer exists. This is not temporary. This is not a setback. It is over. On the surface of Shekvar, billions of Velthari heard these words and looked up at the sky, where the orbital defense ring that had protected their world for a millennium was now empty space. We did not touch your people, Asante continued. We did not touch your cities. We did not touch your hospitals or your schools or your homes. We did not kill a single one of your civilians. We did not even kill a single one of your soldiers. Every crew member on every ship we disassembled is alive and safe in a life pod. He let that sink in. We did this on purpose, not because we could not have done more, but because we chose not to, because we are not you. The words were simple. They were spoken in simple, clear language, without anger or arrogance or hatred, and they hit harder than any weapon the galaxy had ever fired. You burned our children alive and called it strength. We took your entire war machine apart in 11 minutes and did not harm a single one of your children? Think about that. Think about what that means. Think about who has strength and who does not. On the Velthari homeworld in the command bunker, General Cthulhu felt something he had not felt since he was a young soldier facing his first battle. He felt small. What we showed you today was not our full capability, Asante said. I want to be very clear about that. What happened to your military was not everything we can do. It was not even close. We held back. We held back because we believe that strength without mercy is not strength. It is cruelty, and we refuse to become what you made us want to become. Somewhere in the command bunker, a young Velthari officer who had been listening with growing horror quietly set down his sidearm, the last weapon he possessed, and covered his face with his hands. But understand this, Asante's voice did not change. It did not harden. It did not become threatening. It remained exactly as calm and certain as it had been from the first word. This was your one lesson. This was your one demonstration. From this moment forward, if any species, any empire, any coalition, any individual raises a weapon against a human world, the response will not be what happened today. Today we showed restraint. Today we took apart your weapons and left your people alive. If there is a next time, we will not hold back. He paused. There will be no warning. There will be no deadline. There will be no teacher on a screen asking for peace. There will be no admiral explaining what happened afterward. There will be nothing to explain because there will be nothing left. The galaxy absorbed these words in silence. We do not want this. We did not ask for this. 1 year ago, we were teachers and farmers and scientists and parents. We built things. We studied things. We raised our children and taught them to be curious and kind. We were a species that named its ships after poets and its colonies after dreams. For the first time, something moved in Asante's voice. Not anger. Grief. Old, deep, carefully controlled grief. You took that from us. You made us become something else. And now we have to live with what we are. Another pause. A longer one. Elysium 7 will be remembered. Every name, every face, every child who drew pictures on the walls of their school and asked their teachers why the sky was blue. We will remember them. We will make sure the galaxy remembers them, not as victims, as the reason this never happens again. He straightened, and though no one could see him do it, they could hear it in his voice. To the Velthari, we have taken your weapons. We have left your lives. Use them wisely. Build something better than what you were. Become something that deserves to exist in this galaxy. Because we will be watching, and we remember everything. He paused one final time. To the rest of the galaxy, the borders of human space are open again. Our ambassadors will return. Our trade ships will fly. We are still the species that names its ships after poets. But we are also now the species that built the Cascade Lances in a year of silence and grief and rage. Both of those things are true. Both of those things are us. His voice softened. We hope, we truly hope, that no one ever gives us a reason to use them again. The transmission ended. The small human ship remained in orbit around Shekvar for exactly 1 hour. Long enough for the message to be received and understood. Long enough for the reality to set in. Then it turned and left the system the same way it had arrived. Calmly, quietly, without hurry. Behind it, the Velthari Dominion sat in the ruins of its own power and tried to understand what had just happened. In the conquered council chamber, every seat was full. Nobody spoke. The recording of Admiral Asante's message played on a loop on every screen. Delegates stared at it with expressions that ranged from awe to terror, to something that a few of the more honest ones would later admit was admiration. Ambassador Rethan of the Silurians sat in her seat with her feathered crest pressed flat against her skull. She had served as a diplomat for 30 years and had heard 1,000 speeches from 1,000 species. She had never heard anything like this. It was not the power that shook her. Power was common in the galaxy. Every major species had power. What shook her was the choice, the deliberate, conscious, painful choice to have the ability to destroy and to not use it, to reach out across hundreds of light years with a hand that could crush a civilization and instead use it to carefully, gently, precisely remove only the weapons, leaving everything else untouched. When that was not strength. That was something beyond strength. That was something the galaxy had never seen before. In a quiet corner of the chamber, Counselor Mora of the Raccoon sat with closed eyes. The old amphibian had been right about everything. The silence, the preparation, the response, all of it exactly as Mora had predicted. But Mora did not feel satisfied. There was no victory in being right about something like this. Mora opened those ancient eyes and looked at the recording of Kofi Asante's face, frozen on the screen. A logistics officer from Ghana, a man who organized supply shipments, an ordinary person who had been given an extraordinary task and carried it out with a dignity that made Mora's old heart ache. They could have been monsters, Mora whispered. Nope, they had every right. The old counselor closed their eyes again and listened to the silence of a galaxy that was, for the first time in a very long time, truly paying attention. They chose to be something else. Across the galaxy, the recordings were played and replayed, analyzed and reanalyzed. The greatest scientific minds of 1,000 worlds poured over the sensor data, trying to understand the Cascade lances, trying to figure out how humanity had done what they had done. The conclusions were unanimous and terrifying. The technology was at least 1,000 years ahead of anything else in the galaxy. It operated on principles that most species had not even theorized. It could not be replicated. It could not be countered. It could not be defended against. And humanity had developed it in 1 year. 1 year of silence. 1 year of grief. 1 year of every human mind in the galaxy working toward a single purpose. The reports circulated through every government, every military, every intelligence agency, and the conclusion was always the same. No matter who wrote it, no matter what species they belonged to, no matter what their political or military perspective, humanity had not bluffed. Humanity had not even used their full capability. What the galaxy had witnessed was not the limit of human power, it was the limit of human mercy. And that, every analyst agreed, was far more frightening than any weapon could ever be. The days after the Cascade were strange. The galaxy was used to the aftermath of war. It had a rhythm that every species understood. There were supposed to be burning cities and fleeing refugees, and grieving families and angry politicians demanding revenge. There were supposed to be borders redrawn and treaties signed under pressure, and the victors standing over the defeated with their boots on their necks. None of that happened. The Velthari Dominion woke up the morning after the Cascade to find its entire military gone and everything else untouched. The lights still worked. The water still ran. The hospitals still treated the sick. The markets still opened. Children still went to school. It was the strangest kind of defeat in the history of the galaxy. A defeat that killed nothing and no one. A defeat that only took away the ability to hurt others and left everything else perfectly intact. The Velthari did not know what to do with it. For the first few days, there was chaos, not violence. There was nothing to be violent with. The weapons were gone, all of them. Every military weapon on every world in the Dominion had been disassembled at the atomic level. Even personal sidearms, even ceremonial blades in military museums, even training weapons at military academies. The humans had been thorough beyond anyone's ability to comprehend. The chaos was political. The Dominion was a society that had been built entirely around military power. Their government was military. Their economy was military. Their culture was military. Their identity was military. For 3,000 years, the answer to every question, who leads, who decides, who matters, who has value, had been the same. The strong, the ones with weapons, the ones who could fight. Now nobody had weapons. Nobody could fight. Which the foundation that their entire civilization stood on had been removed in 11 minutes, and the building was still standing, and nobody knew why. Warlord Skethan disappeared the night of the Cascade. Some said he had retreated to a secret bunker deep underground. Others said he had fled to the outer reaches of Dominion space. A few said he had taken his own life in the traditional Velthari manner, by walking into the wastes and letting the desert take him. Nobody knew for certain, and after a while nobody cared, because something unexpected was happening on the Velthari homeworld. Something that nobody, not the Velthari themselves, not the watching galaxy, not even Counselor Mora, had predicted. The Velthari were talking to each other, not shouting, not commanding, not clicking mandibles in dominance displays, talking. And in the markets and the public squares and the homes that had been left untouched by the cascade, ordinary Velthari were having conversations that had been impossible for 3,000 years. Because for 3,000 years, every conversation in Velthari society had taken place in the shadow of military power. Every opinion, every idea, every dream had been weighed against the question, does this serve the Dominion? Does this make us stronger? Does this help us fight? Now there was nothing to fight with, and without that shadow, without that constant pressure, something strange and tender began to grow in the spaces where weapons had been. A young Velthari named Seketi was among the first to notice it. She was a student at the University of Shekvar, studying biology. Not military biology, not weapons biology, just biology. Honor the study of living things for the sake of understanding them. It had been considered a waste of time by the old order, a soft subject, unworthy of a true Velthari. She was walking through the campus gardens the morning after the cascade when she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. An old professor, a professor of military history, a veteran of 2 campaigns, a male with scars on his exoskeleton from a dozen battles, was sitting on a bench in the garden, alone, staring at a flowering plant that grew in a crack in the stone path. Seketai had been taught to fear veterans. They were hard and cold, and they looked at students the way a hawk looks at small animals. But this veteran was not looking at anything the way a hawk looks at anything. He was looking at the flower the way a child looks at something beautiful for the first time. She sat down next to him. In the old order, this would have been unthinkable. A student sitting uninvited next to a veteran. But the old order was gone, and the new one had not yet been written. "Are you all right, Professor?" she asked. He did not look at her. He kept looking at the flower. "I have walked past this garden every day for 40 years, he said. His voice was quiet, tired. "I never once noticed there were flowers here." He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his compound eyes that she had never seen in a Velthari veteran before. Doubt. "I spent my entire life building things that were designed to destroy," he said. "Ships, weapons, strategies. I was good at it, the best, and now all of it is gone. And when the only thing that remains is this flower growing out of a crack in the ground." He looked back at the flower. "I think," he said slowly, "that the flower might have been more important all along." Conversations like this were happening all across the Dominion. Not everywhere. Not with everyone. Many Velthari were angry. Many were humiliated. Many wanted revenge, though revenge was a difficult thing to want when you had nothing to take it with. But enough of them. Particularly the young ones, the ones who had not had decades to harden themselves into the shape the old order demanded, were asking questions that had never been asked before. Why did we need to conquer? Why did we need to burn? What were we so afraid of that we needed to make everyone else afraid? These questions had been growing quietly for centuries, buried deep in the private thoughts of Velthari, who had been told their whole lives that such questions were weakness. The cascade did not create the questions. It only removed the structure that had kept them hidden. Within a year, Seketi and a group of young scholars had established the first Velthari Peace Studies program. Within 3 years, the Dominion's governing structure had been peacefully replaced by a civilian council. Within 5 years, Velthari scientists, freed from mandatory military research for the first time in 3 millennia, had made breakthroughs in medicine, agriculture, and environmental science that surprised the entire galaxy. Within 10 years, Velthari scholars would become some of the most passionate advocates for interstellar peace accords in the Concord Council. The very species that had burned Elysium-7 would stand before the galaxy and argue that no civilization should ever have to suffer what they had caused, and what had been done to them in return. It was not a fast transformation. It was not easy. There were setbacks and conflicts and bitter arguments among the Velthari about who they were and who they wanted to become. But the direction was clear, and it was moving forward, and that was more than anyone had expected. The galaxy watched this transformation with a mixture of amazement and confusion. They had expected the Velthari to collapse into anarchy or starvation or civil war. They had expected a conquered people to suffer and struggle and fade. Instead, the Velthari were growing, changing, becoming something new, because humanity had not conquered them. Humanity had freed them. By removing only the weapons and leaving everything else, the humans had done something far more radical than destruction. They had given the Velthari a chance to discover who they were without the ability to hurt anyone. And what the Velthari discovered, slowly and painfully, was that they were more than warriors. They had always been more. They had just forgotten. While the Velthari rebuilt themselves from the inside, the rest of the galaxy was rebuilding its understanding of everything. The galactic Concord restructured. The old way of doing things, endless debates, meaningless resolutions, sanctions that were never enforced, was swept away. Not by force, by shame, by the collective recognition that the Concord had watched 11 million people die and done nothing but talk, and that humanity had been forced to develop weapons that could reshape matter at the quantum level because nobody else had been willing to help. A new doctrine was proposed at the first full session of the Concord after the Cascade. It was called the Elysium Protocols, and it was simple. Any act of aggression against a civilian population would trigger an immediate collective response from the conquered. Not a debate, not a vote, not a resolution, a response. Military intervention, aid, protection, whatever was needed, provided as fast as it could be provided by every species with the capability to help. No more watching, no more talking while cities burned, no more strongly worded letters to empires that used them as fuel for their fires. The vote was unanimous. Every single species in the Concord voted in favor. Even the ones who had argued against intervention for centuries. Even the ones who had privately benefited from the old system of selective inaction. They voted yes because they had seen what happened when a wounded species was left to solve its own problems. They had seen what humanity had built in the silence. And they understood, with a clarity that came from genuine terror, that if they did not create a system of collective protection, then the next species to be pushed too far might not show the restraint that humanity had shown. The vote was also unanimous because the human ambassador was sitting in the chamber when it was held. She did not speak. She did not lobby. She did not threaten or pressure or remind anyone of what humanity could do. She simply sat in her seat, the seat that had been empty for a year, and watched the proceedings with calm, steady eyes. Her name was Dr. Lena Vasquez. She had been appointed as Earth's Conquered Ambassador 3 months after the Cascade. When the news had been announced, some species had thought it was a provocation, sending the woman from the warning broadcast to represent humanity, a reminder, a threat. They were wrong. It was not a threat. It was a statement about who humanity chose to represent them. Not a general, not a politician, a teacher, a woman who had lost everything and still believed in the possibility of a better future. A woman who stood for what humanity wanted to be, not what it had been forced to become. Lena sat in the chamber and watched the Elysium Protocols pass, and she cried, quietly, and with her hands folded in her lap and her shoulders shaking slightly. Not because she was sad, because it had taken the deaths of 11 million people to get the galaxy to agree to protect each other, and because the 11 million dead included her 2 daughters and all of her students and her husband and everything she had ever loved. It should not have cost this much, but it was done, and she would make sure it stayed done. Humanity reopened its borders. Trade ships flew again. Ambassadors returned to their posts. The comm channels buzzed with activity. Human goods flowed back into galactic markets. Medicines, foods, cultural exports, technological innovations. On the surface, things looked normal, but nothing was normal. When a human trade ship entered a space station, other ships moved out of its way. Not because they were ordered to, not because anyone told them to. They just did. the way people naturally step aside when someone walks through a crowd who carries themselves in a way that suggests you should not be in their path. When a human diplomat entered a room, conversations paused. Not stopped, paused. Just for a moment. Just long enough for everyone to register the presence and adjust their behavior accordingly. It was not fear exactly. It was something more complicated than fear. It was the awareness that you were in the presence of a species that could disassemble your entire civilization in 11 minutes and had chosen, deliberately, not to. The word that most species settled on was respect, but it was a new kind of respect. Not the respect that the strong give to the strong or the weak give to the powerful. It was the respect that comes from witnessing someone exercise restraint when they had every justification not to. The respect that comes from watching someone hold a weapon that could destroy everything and put it down. Admiral Kofi Asante retired from the fleet 6 months after the Cascade. He returned to his hometown in Ghana and opened a school. When journalists from across the galaxy traveled to Earth to interview him, he politely declined. He said he had delivered one message and that was enough speaking for one lifetime. He said he preferred to spend his remaining years teaching children about logistics and supply chains, which he still believed were more important than weapons. The journalists wrote their stories anyway. When they described a quiet man with gray hair and steady hands, who grew vegetables in a garden behind his school, and taught math to children who called him Mr. Asante, and did not know that he had once stood in orbit above an alien world and announced the end of an empire. Some journalists traveled deeper into human space, hoping to find the Cascade Lances, hoping to learn how they worked, hoping to see the weapons that had changed the galaxy. They found nothing. The facilities where the Lances had been built were dismantled. The research was classified at a level that no amount of bribery or espionage could penetrate. The scientists who had built them had returned to their universities and hospitals and laboratories and gone back to their normal work. When asked about the Lances, humans would smile politely and change the subject. It not because they were hiding something, because they did not want to talk about it. The Cascade Lances were built from grief and rage, and no human was proud of that. They were proud of the restraint. They were proud that they had used the worst thing they had ever created in the most careful way they could. But the creation itself, the fact that they had been pushed to a place where such a thing was necessary, was not something they celebrated. It was a scar, and like all scars, they carried it but did not show it off. 1 year after the Cascade, Counselor Mora of the Raccoon gave their final address to the Galactic Concord before retiring from public life. The old amphibian was well over 400 years old now, and the events of the past 2 years had aged them further. But their mind was sharp, and their voice, when they spoke, still carried the weight that had made entire chambers fall silent for decades. The chamber was full. Every seat was taken. Delegates from 800 species sat in silence as the oldest living diplomat in the galaxy walked slowly, so slowly, to the center of the chamber floor. Mora stood there for a long time without speaking, just looking around the room, looking at the faces, the old ones who remembered the time before the silence, the young ones who had only known the galaxy as it was now, a galaxy shaped by 11 minutes that changed everything. And in the front row, in the seat that had been empty for a year and was now occupied again, Dr. Lena Vasquez sat with her hands in her lap and watched the old counselor with eyes that held a grief so deep it had become a permanent part of her, like a bone or an organ. Mora looked at her for a long moment. Then the old counselor turned to face the full chamber and spoke. "I have lived for 4 centuries, Mora began. I have seen empires rise and I have seen them fall. I have watched species discover fire, and I have watched species discover faster than light travel. I have witnessed 3 galactic wars and more regional conflicts than I can remember. I have seen the very best and the very worst that sentient life has to offer." The chamber was absolutely silent. "I have seen empires that ruled through cruelty. They built their power on the suffering of others, and they believed that suffering was strength. They lasted for a while. They always do, but they always fell, because cruelty is not a foundation. It is a crack, and cracks always grow." Mora paused, in gathering strength. "I have seen empires that ruled through fear. They built weapons and fleets and armies so vast that no one dared to challenge them. They believed that fear was the same as respect. It is not. Fear is a chain, and chains always break. Another pause. Longer. But I have never, in all my long years, in all my centuries of watching and listening and trying to understand the infinite complexity of life in this galaxy, I have never seen what I saw last year. Mora turned to look directly at the human delegation. Lena Vasquez, her staff, the quiet men and women who represented a species that had been changed forever by a fire they did not start. I saw a species that had the right to destroy, Mora said. Not just the power, the right. They had been wronged in a way that would have justified anything. Their children were burned alive and the burning was broadcast as entertainment. No court in this galaxy would have convicted them if they had responded with total annihilation. Every law of every species allows for retaliation in kind. They could have erased the Velthari from existence, and history would have understood. Mora's voice cracked slightly, and the old counselor paused to compose themselves. In 4 centuries of public speaking, Mora had never lost control of their voice. This was the first time. They chose not to. The words hung in the air. They built a weapon that could have ended a civilization, and instead of using it to end a civilization, they used it to take away the tools of violence and leave everything else standing. They removed the swords and left the people holding them alive and unharmed and free to become something better. Mora looked around the chamber one more time. That is not weakness. I need every being in this chamber to understand that. What humanity did was not weakness. It was the most terrifying form of strength this galaxy has ever witnessed, because it requires more power to restrain yourself than to let go. It requires more courage to show mercy than to show force, and it requires more strength, far more strength, to give your enemy a chance to grow than to simply remove them from existence. The old counselor's eyes were wet. The raccoon did not cry the way humans did, but they had their own version of it, and Mora was doing it now in front of 800 species, without shame. The humans are not gods. They are not perfect. They are a young species who were forced to grow up too fast because the galaxy failed to protect them. They carry scars that will never fully heal. They built something terrible because we left them no choice, and then they used that terrible thing with more care and more compassion and more restraint than any of us had the right to expect. Mora straightened, drawing on the last reserves of a very long life. Do not mistake their mercy for softness. They are not soft. They are the hardest thing in this galaxy because they looked into the darkest part of themselves and chose the light. They are showing us who they choose to be. And every day that they choose mercy over destruction, every day that those cascade lances stay silent, or every day that their teachers and farmers and scientists go about their lives in peace, that is a gift that they are giving to a galaxy that did not earn it and does not deserve it. Mora paused for the last time. Pray they never stop choosing. Pray they never have a reason to choose differently. Because I promise you, I promise every being in this chamber, with every year of my 4 centuries of life behind the words, if humanity ever decides that mercy is not worth the cost, there will be nothing any of us can do. Nothing. The old counselor looked at Lena Vasquez one final time. Their eyes met across the chamber. The teacher who had lost everything, the counselor who had seen everything, 2 beings from opposite ends of the galaxy, connected by the same understanding. Mora nodded to her. She nodded back. Be worthy of their mercy, Mora said. All of you, every day, for the rest of your lives. The old counselor turned and walked slowly, painfully, out of the chamber. The doors closed behind them. Nobody moved for a very long time. The speech was broadcast across the galaxy. It became the most watched recording in the history of the Concord, surpassing even Lena Vasquez's warning and Admiral Asante's address combined. It was translated into every known language. It was taught in schools. It was quoted in diplomatic meetings and peace negotiations and late-night conversations between friends. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The galaxy changed. New species joined the Concord. Old conflicts faded. The Elysium protocols held and held and held, not because they were enforced by human weapons, because they were enforced by the memory of what happened when they were not. Earth's final warning echoed through the ages, not as a threat, as a reminder of what 11 million people died for, a reminder of what one species built in grief and used in mercy, a reminder that the silence between the stars is not empty, it is full of choices. And the most important choice any species will ever make is not what it does with its power, but what it chooses not to do. On Elysium 7, nothing grew anymore. The surface was still glass, still dead, still a monument to the worst thing one species had ever done to another. But in orbit above the dead world, a station had been built, a memorial station. It was open to every species in the galaxy, free of charge, always. Inside the station, there was a wall. It stretched for kilometers, curving along the station's outer ring, visible through windows that looked down on the scarred surface below. On the wall in small, careful letters were 11 million names. Every single person who had lived on Elysium 7. Every adult, every child, every teacher and farmer and doctor and artist and student. At the beginning of the wall before the names started, there was a single inscription. It was written in every known galactic language, and it said, they had names, they had faces, they had dreams. They were real. Remember them, and make sure this never happens again. Visitors came from every corner of the galaxy. They walked along the wall in silence, reading the names, looking down at the glass surface of a world that should have been full of life. They came in groups, and they came alone. They came as tourists, and they came as pilgrims. They came with curiosity, and they came with grief, and they came with guilt. And at the very end of the wall, after the last name, there was one more inscription, smaller, almost easy to miss. It said, we could have been monsters. We had every right. We chose to be something else. This wall is for the ones who did not get to choose. Below those words, a small plaque, a name, a title, and a date. Dr. Lena Vasquez, teacher, Elysium 7. She had asked for nothing else. The galaxy remembered. The silence spoke. And in the vast and spinning dark, humanity went about its business, teaching and building and studying and raising children and naming its ships after poets. And the cascade lances stayed silent in their hidden places, and the stars turned. And the memorial wall grew longer as visitors from every species left tokens and messages and flowers from 1,000 worlds at its base. And the peace held. Not because anyone was afraid, because everyone remembered.